Lyme, en la peste, en el estudio de las garrapatas, de los ácaros, de la sarna y de pequeños mamíferos, lo cual incluye el estudio de la ecología y epidemiología de enfermedades infecciosas de comunidades complejas. Aunque la mayoría de los sistemas que estudia están relacionados con enfermedades transmitidas por vectores, por ejemplo, la enfermedad de Lyme, la sarna o la peste, también es líder de proyectos de problemas ecológicos de enfermedades infecciosas aplicadas en otros sistemas, incluida la quitridiomicosis en ranas y en salamandras, así como la dinámica de transmisión al huésped de enfermedades de reptiles y enfermedades en corales. En general, el objetivo de la doctora Janet es comprender cómo la complejidad de la comunidad contribuye a la persistencia y a la aparición de enfermedades y cómo los factores impulsores se ven afectados por el cambio antropogénico. Muchas gracias, doctora.
Maybe I need to yell. Okay. It is such a pleasure to be here. I was last in Hermosillo in 1989 when my husband and I started in Panama a backpacking hippie trip through Central America up through Mexico. Finally got on a plane in Phoenix and went home. So I really didn't have much of a memory about Hermosillo, and it's just really a pleasure to be back. Whenever I work in Mexico, I love Mexican culture. I love the diversity of Mexican culture and, of course, Mexican food. And the people here have just been, working with Mexican collaborators has been really a highlight of my career. And as I heard our moderator's introduction, I don't know, I guess I'm a little embarrassed because it sounds really, really broad and really, really unfocused. Reptiles and, this and that. And it's true that there's been a lot of various projects. But I will say that this project is more than a project to me. Having the privilege of working on the problem of Rocky Mountain spotted fever is a really fulfilling and important thing that I get to do. I get to learn from some of my mentors, whom I would include Dave Walker and Chris Paddock as mentors. And I've learned a lot, and I've been very deeply humbled by the people affected by the disease, primarily in Baja, that I've studied, that I've worked with, into whose homes I've been able to go. And it's a pleasure to be here today to share with you just a small part of the kind of work that my lab and I have been doing. So she introduced me also as an ecologist. And as an ecologist, a lot of what I am excited by is ecological principles and theory. So a certain amount of this talk is going to feel a little more theoretical, maybe, than some of the applied, how do we treat, how do we diagnose? This part of the talk, I will honestly say that Gerardo Alvarez said, would you please talk about this? So I said, sure. So this is work that was done by myself and two of my postdocs, thinking about ticks as invasive species. And in the literature, if you Google invasive species, most of what you're going to find is going to be about weeds, plants, new plant species that come into a new country or continent or area and cause problems, often by out-competing other native plants and things that are important. So we tried to take some of the principles of the plant literature and apply it to tick literature. And then for today, I wanted to apply that to brown dog ticks. So we'll start with the theory about what an invasive event is. And probably many of you think, oh, I know what an invasion is. It's a new movement of one thing to another place, and that's certainly true. But it's also got a couple of distinct steps that we can identify. And each author you read is going to say, these are the steps, and another author will say, this is my set of steps, and they don't totally agree. But we mostly all agree that there's an introduction event, an establishment event, which is in red, because that's just the main thing that most of us care about, and then the potential for additional spread. And oops, I will try to avoid going backwards and forwards too. And then some people subdivide it even further, and we'll talk about the barriers in a second, and then it can history can repeat itself. So here's a schematic of the steps: transport, establishment, and spread. And I will break them down further in another second, but we can think of each one as a barrier. So can a tick be transported? If it can be transported, and is, it successfully breaches one barrier. Now, can it hang out? Can it stay there for a bit? If it can, we can consider it established. Once it's established, it has the opportunity to continue to spread. So that first barrier, they have to be transported. You guys all know that ticks can't fly. Damn it. Generally, they can't jump, right? Although I've heard of some African ticks that can run, literally get on their back 2 legs and run. Haven't seen that myself, but I think it would be pretty cool and scary. Really, tick movement, except at very small scales, is limited to host movement. We know that, okay? But any organism, its potential to be an invasive organism is going to be higher if the organism's population is dense, where it originally comes from, if it prefers to feed on mobile hosts, birds. Birds would be probably one of the best hosts for transporting a new parasite of any sort, and if it tends to come often. This is a study done by another student in my lab, Ben Plourde, and you're not going to be able to read the small letters, so I will do it for you. But what he did is he said, of all the studies where someone's looked at a disease spillover event from one species to another, and with a strong focus on people, we know that there's bias, right? We know that certain species tend to be studied more often. So he took that bias out mathematically and said, well, which species account for the greatest risk of spillover? And they're going to be here. Rodents are number 1, bats are number 2, carnivores are number 2, artiodactyls, hoofstock are number 3, and bats are number 4. Hoofstock, carnivores. Okay, so you've got your tick, it's been spread somehow, maybe from Africa in the 1500s. And now it may or may not become established, okay? And if it becomes established, the odds of it being established are higher if it has these characteristics. High host plasticity. If it will only feed as a specialist on one host, that host is probably not there. It's not going to be established. If it has a short generation time, it has more opportunities to produce offspring and become established. It's not logically the case that it would have to prefer anthropogenically modified environments, but it is statistically the case that most invaders of all taxa, plants and animals, prefer anthropogenically modified environments. If it has a reproductive strategy that allows it, so for example, when you first are present in a new environment, it may be difficult to find a mate. If you're parthenogenetic, it doesn't matter, right? Or there's other different reproductive strategies that will facilitate offspring production. And then wide thermotolerance, wide ability to tolerate different basic environmental conditions. All of these increase the odds of establishment. The last barrier is spread. Once the organism is established, it can continue to spread. It can spread in two different ways. The first one is saltation, which is it probably translate better in Spanish than English, honestly, but it literally means a jump over an unoccupied space, over a mountain range, over a water body or whatever, and that will only happen on a host. And then the other graphic there is actually my favorite example. The laser pointer is a little weak, but that's okay. My favorite example of diffusion type spread, I don't know, maybe you all know that raccoons were introduced, well, I mean, raccoons were present. Rabid raccoons were introduced into the central mid-Atlantic states in the United States by mistake through a hunting club that moved raccoons to have a population to hunt, brought rabies with them, and rabies progressively diffused out in every direction except east, because that's ocean. So diffused gradually, year by year, at a set rate, north, south, and west. So those are the different means of spread. All right, human beings, in so many ways, influence invasion. And climate change, as it's not just getting started, but it's just getting started in earnest, will have a lot of impacts that are somewhat unpredictable, but on the whole, really do facilitate spread. Anthropogenic land use changes, as I mentioned, statistically can, and especially since a lot of our invaders are weedy, they're really tolerant of change, right? And if they're tolerant of change, they're often tolerant of the changes we make to the environment. With climate change in particular, you probably heard of the concept of climate refugees. Human beings that have to move off of islands or away from coasts or into new habitats that are habitable. And then the last way that humans can facilitate invasion has been going on for a long time, and in fact, it is how the tick first got to the Americas from Africa, and that's through global trade, and especially the trade of animals and animal products. A lot of these things impact family resources. They change movement patterns of people, and especially the civil unrest, migration, and climate change refugees can put extra pressures on just survival and reduce available resources for public health capacity. So, admittedly, this paper was written for, and this graphic was developed for the United States focus. And I will be honest that I don't know very much about various different invasive ticks in Mexico. So if somebody wants to grab me after this talk, sometime during the day and say, hey, do you know about this story? Or send me an email. I'd love to learn more about invasion events into Mexico. But really what this shows is even within the United States, just within the United States, we've got an invasion of Asian longhorn tick, widespread movement and diffusion spread of Dermacentor variabilis. Ixodes scapularis continues to change, largely due to climate change in that case. Rhipicephalus sanguineus, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and then amblyomma species. Dr. Walker was talking some about Lone Star ticks, but all of our habitat modeling suggests that a lot of the Mexican and Latin American amblyomma species could do quite well in the United States as well. Okay. And then this is really the same thing in a table. I don't expect you to read it, but I want you to just sort of go, wow, those are a lot of invasion events. Okay. One quick case study to kind of illustrate some of the concepts that I talked about is the Asian longhorn tick. So when I put Southeast Asia in air quotes because it actually goes up into Russia, it's in some of the island nations in the Pacific. It has at least two very distinct lineages, one of which requires sexual, a male and a female, and sexual reproduction, and the other is a parthenogenic lineage. And the one that is present in the United States now is the parthenogenetic lineage. And it lays a lot of eggs, so it's highly fecund. And it feeds on everything. It feeds on dogs, it feeds on cows, it feeds on deer. So now that it's establishing in the United States, it really does well on deer, which are common in the East. And it has already been shown to spread, invade, and establish, for example, from Australia into New Zealand and some of the islands around. So we have already been able to watch the process of its invasion. Again, the Asian longhorn tick is now, I'm sorry, this map from CDC, I actually don't remember what year I got it from, but it is now, as of the most recent data, in 18 states. According to the USDA website, it likely got here in 2010. Its first reported documentation was in 2013, and then it hit the news in 2017 when a very heavily infested individual sheep was seen with this tick, and that's going to be 7 years after we think it was first introduced. It's almost certain that someone shipped an animal infested with this tick. Unknowingly. And so now it's present in 18 states. So many things you can do on Google when you're sitting there going, I have to get this talk written. One of the things I did on Google is I Googled, is this tick reported at all in Mexico? Because I did not want to stand here and say, oh. So I'm like, Google, tick, Mexico, longhorn, invasion, da-da-da. It is not, to my knowledge, been detected in Mexico, right? But it continues to move south. And I just want to highlight this paper that I have down here, which is I was talking with one of you, Maureen, right? That's the paper that does the really great risk assessment. I mean, it's just a spectacularly well-done risk assessment as to whether, where, when we can expect the Asian longhorn tick to invade Mexico. Okay, so now we're going to not switch gears, but evolve to probably what you're a little more interested in, and that would be our brown dog tick. So the brown dog tick, of all the ticks I've worked with, is the ugliest, just least pleasant tick to see under the microscope. You can have these beautiful ticks like Amblyomma cajunense. Dermacenter ticks are much more beautiful. They have the ornation on their back, but brown dog tick is, yeah, the little brown blob. It has a preference. Its preference in all three of its feeding stages is the dog, but it's not a host specialist. It's an important disease vector. I haven't heard a lot of conversation here the last 2 days about some of these other diseases that are transmitted. Rickettsia canis is rarely a human pathogen, but there are documented cases of true Rickettsia canis infection in people. Anaplasma platis is a primarily canine infection. Both of those are transmitted by brown dog ticks, and as veterinarians doing a lot of sentinel work, that's helpful for us to know because we see a lot of those, and wherever we see those, we are pretty sure there's a brown dog tick problem. It stalks its prey, which is a little different than some that are what we call questing. So questing ticks are going to be a tick that climbs to the top of grass and waits. A stalking behavior is what it sounds like. And it is one of the only ticks that we work with that is fully peridomestic. Literally, all the other ticks that we've talked about in North America, the deer ticks and the dermacenter species ticks and so forth, require a wildlife sylvatic component to their life cycle. This tick will live in someone's home under their sofa its entire life. It will reproduce on the family dog, and it will go back down under the sofa. Okay? Just different tick. There's some evidence originally described from France, and then some work that was done in my lab, that as it gets hotter, the tick changes its behavior a little bit. It does feed more, And it seems to be less picky about whether it's feeding on a dog. This is not super picky anyway, but it does prefer a dog. And so what Laura did in this study is she created a device. And so in one part of the device is a very patient 19-year-old senile dog that was mine that would just sit there and eat cookies and just, like, I don't care. And then the other one was a grad student. And then the ticks were not allowed to feed on the dog or the grad student, but the ticks could choose. There's a cafeteria experiment, as we call it. They could choose, I'm going to go to the grad student or I'm going to go to the dog. And it really depended on how hot it was, the conditions. As it got hotter, many more of them were more interested in going to the human being. All righty, I don't know. This is a video. Does anybody know if this will work? What do I do to make it work? I don't have a button I can click. Oh, I do. So this is Ensenada, some of our investigation in Ensenada. Every one of these is ticks, and this is a home. And you can't hear the audio, but he's just saying, muchas garrapatas. Look at that great big one. Oh, we don't need to watch it again. All righty. 4 life stages, like all hard ticks. 3 feed on animals. Larvae only feed for a few days. Adults can feed for a couple weeks. Males, this is interesting. Males may feed multiple times. They may take partial feedings, and they may switch hosts. They may move to a different individual host, okay? And there's some evidence, probably not super important, that if a male is present, the nymphs are more avid feeders. We know that if a male is present, the adult females are more, many tick species are more likely to finish their feeding. But there's evidence that the presence of males induces more feeding by the nymph. They have huge clutch sizes, huge. They live, as you just saw, in cracks, in adobe, and dirt, and under rocks, and in rocks, and all kinds of interesting places. And they can have, depending on the temperature, a couple of generations a year. So think back to what I said makes for a good invasive tick. This guy has it all. Okay. How far do they move? If we're going to invade, we got to think about moving local, medium, broad scale. So they can move on their own 20 to 40 centimeters. I think the video was too much for them. I'm just kidding. They can move 20 to 40 centimeters. Remember that. And Andres, I don't know if you guys heard Andres' talk. And frankly, I was going to look up, when I was writing this talk, exactly how far the dogs moved in that study. And how far was it in the end? Not very far. Kilometer. 2 meters? The dogs, when 1 kilometer, 1 kilometer. So not like the whole city, just a kilometer. That was about what I remembered. And if the tick's moving on a stray dog is going to be, actually fairly local. And then if they're going to move much farther, it's going to be on a dog. So this picture is provided to me by our good friend Efren Zazueta. This is a home in, I want to say Tijuana, a home. This dog is infested. The bed is infested. The bed is infested. There is a young child in the home. And all of these are tick egg masses. Okay? So at the very local scale, that's what we're looking at. Okay. This picture is from Mexicali. It's a pit bull. Really, really sweet dog. And my crazy team went up to home after home like this with giant pit bulls and said, can we hold your dog down and take a blood sample? We're still here. Well, anyway, so this pit bull is in a home that is infested with ticks. This home is infested with ticks. It does not have a dog. 20 to 40 centimeters. I'm getting this little minor delay in moving the thing, so. Okay. Also Mexicali. A little hard to see, but these are medical students from UABC, and they're going door to door with us and delivering a questionnaire and collecting samples and such. And they have friends. Their little friends are street dogs. And these are the dogs that Andres was talking about. They're owned by someone. Someone feeds them. Someone has named them. And they hang out on the street. And when it's time for dinner, they go home. And so they move about 1 kilometer, taking their ticks with them. And, this is a sort of a typical patio for Mexicali. This is also excellent habitat for brown dog ticks. So these doggies can just go here and poop and leave a brown dog tick, and here and poop and leave a brown dog tick. Get the picture. Well, not so much during pooping, but taking their rest, I mean. Okay. This is a strong statement. There are essentially now no requirements, no effective requirements for moving dogs back and forth across the United States and the Mexican border. And you're going to be like, wait, no, there are. No, there aren't. Look it up. Dogs are required to have higher control when they enter the United States if they come from a country with a high risk of rabies. But until now, Mexico is not on the rabies high risk list, okay? So that reduces any scrutiny of dogs. How many of you guys have driven across the border from Mexico to the United States, driven with a dog, right? What happened? Nothing. They could not care less at the American border whether you're bringing a dog. Supposedly you're supposed to have a health certificate and proof of rabies, and I've done it dozens of times and never been checked. And now they don't even have that requirement. Okay. USDA does require when you import pets that you meet some minimum standards. They're not enforced. Their standards are enforced more if you're coming from screwworm. Mexico doesn't have screwworm. And we've dropped our requirement for health certificates, and it's reciprocal, right? Mexico also doesn't particularly care if we're bringing dogs south. So there's no documentation as of 2019, unless it changes, to bring your dog in either direction. What I want to show you in this slide is a study that was done in Imperial County. And again, it's hard to see, but here is the United States-Mexico border. So here's Mexicali, and Calexico, and then El Centro. And what the pie charts are the proportion of dogs that are seropositive. And there's a strong linear relationship between being close to the border and being more likely to be seropositive. In Imperial County, which is the eastern county in California on the Mexico-United States border, Imperial County has 1 resident veterinarian in the entire county. So many, many people bring their dogs to Mexico for veterinary care. Or they have family in one side or the other. I mean, crossing that border with your dog is beyond common. Okay. So Andres, again, also introduced this. Let me talk about it in this context. Here's one of their dogs. Here's one of their coyotes. As an aside, I was walking my dogs last week, and I heard coyotes out in the distance, and I took video of it and audio when I brought it home, and everyone in my family went, chickens? I'm like, really? So apparently coyote howling sounds like chickens to my family, my husband even. All right, so anyway, here's a chicken with a satellite collar on him. And, we did see a Rickettsia DNA positive coyote in far eastern California. We've seen brown dog tick infested coyotes. So one of the questions was, how much can coyotes move brown dog ticks? We already know dogs only move them if people move dogs. Can coyotes go farther? Well, actually, there's a potential for coyotes, especially young males, to go quite far, but generally they don't. Young males often leave their family, and they go, many kilometers. But often they stay kind of local. And what this map shows, this is one of several maps that Jake and Andres produced, but what it shows is coyotes wandering around in and out of people's yards and farms, a dairy. Every night this one would go to the dairy inside. So yeah, coyotes do have a potential to share dog ticks and spread them. All right, really recent paper that was just published and looked at the genotyping of, now this is Rickettsia rickettsii. The circles are mine, and they only did this based on a few genes, but basically it looks like the Rickettsia strains from Baja, Sonora, and Chihuahua share a decent amount of genetic identity. The Chihuahuan, Coahuilan, and Durangan species, isolates also shared some genetic similarity. And then the one from San Luis Potosi was not related to the others at this level. So how do we account for this kind of pattern? Ticks, right? Movement of ticks. So little twist that I haven't really brought up, the brown dog tick is not a thing. It is several things that look exactly the same. It's several different genetic lineages, and in fact, 2 different species. One species has not been named yet. But we call them the tropical and the temperate lineage. The tropical lineage is found more in tropical areas. So that's going to be, you know, the white parts of the map with the blue dots. Those are all tropical lineage ticks. Temperate lineage. So this map misses some of the northward extent of the temperate lineage. I found them in North Dakota, for example. But the temperate lineage tends to survive more in colder temperatures, et cetera, et cetera. Is that important? Are these ticks moving? Well, yes, they are, or I wouldn't have been talking about this. A much harder slide to see. This is a cladogram showing that the temperate lineage ticks are all sort of clustered together. There's this tropical lineage tick. Right along the border of the United States-Mexico border, it tended towards temperate, and then we've seen more and more tropical. There's a couple of interesting citations, but that literature just keeps getting updated as we get more DNA capability, more studies. But here's 2 studies, one done in my lab and one, I don't know if Maureen will talk about this, but both of them are showing this northern movement of the tropical lineage. And what allows that northward movement of the tropical lineage is, 1, all the types of invasive behavior I just talked about, and 2, the climate is becoming more permissive farther north, okay? So in this map, we've got dots that represent tropical lineage ticks. So, you know, most of the ticks that we've seen in southern California and northern Mexico are tropical, but we've got them moving, even a couple years ago, up as far north as Los Angeles. So there's every expectation they'll continue to move up through the Central Valley. And then similarly in Arizona, 0% yellow, 0% is 0% temperate, tropical. Quite a lot of tropical in the south and potentially moving its way north. All right, so brown dog ticks are really, 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 really hard to manage. They're even harder to manage when resources are limiting. And where we see big problems with brown dog ticks and big problems with the diseases that they transmit do tend to be these under-resourced communities, marginalized parts of some of the cities in Mexico, some of the tribal areas and small rural areas in the United States. In some of these areas, there may be sort of lack of access to some of the internet. I mean, phones are ubiquitous anywhere, but lower levels of literacy, perhaps, and especially health and family protection literacy. Lack of data on dog demography makes it difficult to know when we have vaccines what to do with them. But you know, I don't know if everybody heard Andres' talk, but that's something that we've been very interested in, is getting more information on dog demography. On-dog acaricides are very, very expensive. Brown dog ticks are incredibly resistant to treatment. So if you say, oh no, you know, we go in, we fumigate, The question is, how many studies have gone back 1 month, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years? Because when you do, you really, really often find they have the ticks again. Okay? What are the most impactful interventions? We can't afford them all, so we're trying to learn what those are. Unrestricted international canine movement. So, and I didn't really bring this up, but for example, in the European Union, when they became the European Union, they harmonized all of their importation protocols. Meaning, so probably you remember, England used to have this extremely strict canine quarantine. To become part of the European Union, they had to drop their canine quarantine to match the rest of the EU. So it's a trend of making it easier to move dogs around. And then we've already talked about climate disasters. Okay, so it's a crisis, in my opinion, and I think that's been well documented here. I want to remember as a veterinarian that it also has huge, huge impacts on dogs, dog populations, not just by killing dogs outright, but by causing people to kill dogs. In some communities, the response to outbreaks of Rocky Mountain fever has been to euphemistically depopulate, kill the dogs. So it has a huge impact. It's sporadic. Even where it's not epidemic, we still occasionally see cases. Okay? Now, taking this back to invasion theory, a history of invasion across every species that has been examined for invasion, knowing that it invaded one time means it's more likely to see an invasion later. Putting it back, these are the things in the brown dog tick, just repeating what I said were high-risk activities for any invasive species. It prefers an abundant host that tolerates anthropogenically modified environments. That would be a dog. It is a host generalist, yeah, especially when it's hot, it'll feed on, people, for example, coyotes, other things. Intense parasitism. You've seen those pictures, a dog that has 1,000 ticks, that's intense, and 5,000 eggs. It wants to be on a mobile host. Well, dogs are not particularly mobile, but we make them mobile. It survives a broad range of habitats. Non-nidicolous means it's not in a nest. It does get in cracks, and actually, I didn't know this about brown dog ticks, but I read about it yesterday. Okay, this is kind of cute. They snuggle up with their friends when it gets cold, and that improves their survival. I'm not kidding. That's what I read. Okay. Yeah, and we've certainly documented extensions and invasions and spread of brown dog ticks before. We need to use this information to continue to predict potential spread, to do that risk assessment like that beautiful paper that I just described for the Asian longhorn tick. Surveillance is fine, right? I do a lot of surveillance. I'm a huge fan of surveillance, but what are you picking up? You're not picking up the introduction. You're picking up post-establishment. You're not going to pick up the introduction with surveillance. It took 7 years for one of the most prolific ticks known to spread in the world, the Asian longhorn tick, to be detected. So surveillance is something you use for other purposes, but not to detect the introduction, in my opinion. So you have to assume that the tick could get there, and when it gets there, you have to have a plan. I guess I don't really have a pithy thing to wrap this up with, other than to say I really miss my cat, but I'll see her tomorrow. And I could not do this work, and I would not want to do this work without just the wonderful and highly productive collaboration and friendships that have evolved from this. But a lot of us who do tick disease, biology, ecology, epidemiology, I suppose you get a little bit of a morgue humor, or you just like what you do, and you're like, oh, it's fun, this is so interesting, it's fun. Being here reminds me it's not all fun. I'm really interested and passionate about this, but I love to hear your stories, and that's how I learn. So it was definitely my privilege to be here, and thank you very much.
We have 3 questions. For how long does an infected brown dog tick has to buy to spread Rickettsia?
Yeah. So there's, especially from the Lyme disease literature, there's a lot of interest in how long it takes after the first bite before the actual transmission of the pathogen. And so there's two ways of looking at it. On average, when is it mostly? And it's, 2 days for Lyme disease. But there's also what's the earliest, right? The earliest ever documented is something like 10 hours. Okay, so similarly for rickettsii, on average, it does take a couple of days to be efficient to transmit infection. But do you guys know what the fastest that anybody's documented transmission would be? 6 hours, right, yeah.
Second one, could the difference in the lineage of Rickettsia sanguineus explain the severity of the cases in Mexico
Well,
and South America?
yeah, so the question is, we know that we have more of the tropical lineage in Mexico and Central America and Northern South America, and we have a much more severe disease problem here, right here, for example, in Sonora. And as a scientist, I really like to have all theories in mind. And so there's a lot of them. One is we may have a more virulent strain or strains of rickettsii. It may be that the tropical lineage is a more efficient vector. It may be that that there's something synergistic between the two of them. A host that gets exposed to brown dog ticks in some of the environments that I've worked in, for example, in Tijuana and Mexicali, they're exposed to many tick bites. So there may be something about dose inoculation. So I really don't know all of the parts that could factor in, but I know that we know all the possibilities, and our whole group systematically is examining those.
And the third one, which virulence factors and weather conditions benefit the spread of rickettsii during winter?
So, if I understand, which stage of the tick transmits during winter? Yeah.
Probably.
So I mean, this tick seasonally. If you're a tick biologist and you want to come to Hermosillo and study brown dog ticks and you want to be sure you collect a lot of them, you want to come when it's as hot as possible. Because that's when they're most active. However, in December of last year, when we were desperate to get ticks for another study, we were in Imperial County collecting them in December. There were far fewer of them, but all three stages are still present and active at the border and south all year long.
Okay, that's it. We thank dear Janet, your beautiful tuck.
Beautiful pictures of ticks.
El Departamento de Medicina y Ciencias de la Salud de la Facultad Interdisciplinaria de Ciencias Biológicas y de la Salud de la Universidad de Sonora le otorga la presente constancia a la doctora Janet Foley por su conferencia Cómo se disemina y establece la garrapata café del perro en el mundo, el 9 de noviembre de 2023. Muchas gracias. Bueno, ahora les vamos a presentar a la doctora Maureen Brophy. Ella nos va a presentar su conferencia intitulada El enfoque Una Salud, una estrategia de salud pública para lidiar con las enfermedades transmitidas por garrapatas. Voy a darles una breve reseña de su currículum. La doctora Brophy es epidemióloga del Departamento de Zoonosis Rickettsiales en los Centros de Prevención y Control de Enfermedades de los Estados Unidos. Tiene cerca de 10 años de experiencia trabajando con comunidades indígenas en el suroeste de Estados Unidos, promoviendo la equidad en salud y construyendo la capacidad local para la prevención de enfermedades transmitidas por vectores. Su trabajo se enfoca primariamente en la fiebre manchada de las montañas rocosas asociada a Rickettsia sanguíneos en Arizona. La doctora Maureen tiene un doctorado en entomología y ciencia de los insectos por la Universidad de Arizona y también tiene una maestría en salud pública en epidemiología de las enfermedades infecciosas y salud internacional por la Universidad de Boston. Muchas gracias, doctora. Adelante.
Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here, very appreciative of the invitation, and just honored to be among among the speakers when there's such an amazing lineup. So I hope that you all benefit from what I'm going to talk about. Like she just said, I've been working with indigenous nations in Arizona and the surrounding area for about 10 years. And I'm going to be completely honest, the first time I went out on an RMSF prevention campaign, I met Dr. Paddock and my predecessor in Rickettsia zoonosis branch, namely Drexler, and I went to people's houses, I collared their dogs, I applied pesticide, and it changed the entire trajectory of my career and my entire life. So I'm very honored to share that passion with you. So One Health is a very broad, general concept, but when you think about the very basics, we interact with animals throughout our entire lives, on a daily basis, whether it's the food that we eat, our pets in our homes, or the squirrel that runs across the street. We're always interacting with animals in our environment, and the interconnectedness between animals and our health is very profound. Sorry about that. So One Health is a pretty new term, but the concept has been around for thousands of years. It's a very holistic approach, and in fact, in many indigenous cultures, it is actually it's just considered health. There's a Navajo word for it. It's gonjo. I'm probably mispronouncing it, so if anyone has Navajo relatives, I apologize. But it is just a term that means that we're all connected, we're all in this together, basically. But as we move on, as more emerging infectious diseases come about, One Health is getting more and more attention. We're seeing more of the interconnectedness and more of the impact of animal health and health in the environment impacting human health because human ranges are expanding. We're having a bigger impact on the environment, and therefore it's fighting back and having a bigger impact on us. And Rocky Mountain spotted fever is the perfect example of this happening. So it is a zoonotic disease, as you have heard many times, and dogs can get sick from it. It presents very similarly in dogs as it does in humans, but Andres said it perfectly, the dogs can't complain about it. So we're not hearing, from the dogs that they're reporting it. But there are case fatality rates, dogs are dying of it, between 1% and 10% of the time. So it's a disease that is not only impacting us, it's also impacting the dogs, and that's where we really have to start thinking about the integrated approaches to preventing this, because when it's impacting multiple different species of animal, that means there's more room for interventions. Okay. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about what's going on, or what has been going on in Arizona. So in 2003, the first fatal case of RMSF was identified in one of our tribal nations in eastern Arizona. It was a 14-month-old child that passed away from the disease. So the case was investigated, and they determined that it was being transmitted by the brown dog tick, not the expected dermacenter ticks that had been transmitting RMSF in the United States for many years before that. After that, more cases appeared only on tribal lands in Arizona throughout the next several years. And currently, we consider 2 of these tribes to be hyper-endemic. So they have ongoing cases that are being locally transmitted. The other nations the other tribal communities that had cases of the disease, they were able to implement swift interventions. They were able to control it, and to date, we haven't had further cases. But the 2 most highly impacted tribes have accounted for, a couple hundred cases and over 50 deaths so far in Arizona, which is, not a large number when compared to the outbreaks across the states in northern Mexico. But when you consider the size of these communities, it does have a large impact. So we currently consider it hyper-endemic in the 6 tribal communities, although the ongoing transmission is only happening in 2. And we see the same epidemiology of RMSF in Arizona as we're seeing here in Mexico. The cases being clustered in geography, higher incidence in children, and a higher case fatality rate compared to the rest of the United States. And this higher case fatality rate is largely explained by the fact that our surveillance for spotted fever group rickettsiosis captures a lot more mild rickettsiosis, whereas in Arizona, to date on these tribal nations, we're only seeing true rickettsii. So you've heard a whole lot about the ecology of the brown dog tick, but I'm going to throw a couple of different factors into it as well. So we've covered how there's the physical ecology in the communities where this is being transmitted. There's a lot of off-host harborage. The communities are oftentimes remote. They are tribal nations. They're sovereign, and they have limited access to solid waste removal and very favorable year-round tick environment. So the climate is the colds aren't so cold, the hots get really hot, but brown dog tick does not care about them. The other ecology that is important is the host-associated ecology. So much like in many of the communities here in northern Mexico that are impacted, there are very large populations of free-roaming dogs. And this is compounded by the fact that there's very limited access to veterinary care, including spay and neuter services, which, it might be throwing a bucket on a house fire, but at least it would be something. And then one of the biggest things that I'm going to talk about is the perceptions of animal responsibility. There have been so many times when I've been, on a prevention campaign, trying to treat dogs and treat houses to protect against RMSF. You come across a dog and you say, "Oh, is this your dog?" And there's like, "No, I just feed it. It sleeps, under my car." So people are caring for dogs, but they don't assume the ownership of that dog. And so changing that perception, changing that dynamic, we've seen that can have a big impact on how well the animals are cared for. And the other ecology that I want to talk about is cultural. The Arizona is home to 27 federally recognized tribes, and each of them has a rich, diverse culture that goes back thousands of years. But they have also been the victims of cultural genocide, historical trauma, many different aspects that have put them at higher risk for a lot of social and health-related outcomes, including mental illness, addiction, diabetes, hypertension, and all of these factors compound one another. So you're obviously, if I had an infestation of ticks in my home, it would be my primary concern to get rid of those ticks. But I am not dealing with a lot of the, access to health care and, chronic illnesses that other communities are. So I would be able to focus on that, whereas if you have a lot of different things going on, it may not be your highest priority. So in 2012, one of the highly impacted tribes started on an RMSF rodeo project in collaboration with CDC, as well as the State Health Department, Arizona State Department of Health, Indian Health Service, which provides some of the services internal to the tribes, and then some other nonprofit partners. So this rodeo project was testing to determine how effective integrated pest management could be on reducing the number of ticks and subsequently cases of RMSF in the community. So the interventions were applying long-lasting tick collars to dogs, spraying homes in the impacted area with pesticides, and probably most importantly, conducting community education. This proved to be very effective, and added to that, since the project began, some tribes also have added harborage reduction to this integrated strategy, which is also a helpful component. But it didn't stop there. The pilot was successful, and so we wanted to move forward with that. So that research translated into direct public health action. So the RMSF rodeo project demonstrated a reduction of ticks in the environment. It demonstrated a reduction of ticks on the dogs in the community, both the ones that were owned and the ones that were free, well, the ones that were restricted to the property and the ones that were free roaming. And in the following 2 years, a 43% reduction in cases. And so it's become the gold standard. It's what we try to encourage tribes to conduct if they have the resources to do so. But really, the question is it enough? I mean, I'm going to show you some numbers here in a minute, but we're still seeing ongoing cases. So, it has to be sustained. It takes a lot of effort. And honestly, it's in the grand scheme of things, it's a very costly way to reduce the incidence of a disease. But when it comes to, people dying, especially young children, you have to weigh human life versus the cost. But we have also seen that without the efforts being sustained and continuously applied, not only the tick populations, but the case counts will just bounce right back. So to demonstrate a little bit of what I'm talking about, I want to talk about the two most highly impacted tribes. And you'll forgive me, but I never present the name of our tribes without their direct permission. So I'm just going to call them tribe number 1 and tribe number 2. So these two tribes are similarly located in Arizona, but at very different elevations. So they are very different ecotypes. So tribe 1 is right at the edge of the Sonoran Desert. So it's got very hot summers, up to 115 degrees in the summertime, and it barely ever gets close to freezing in the evening. Tribe 2 is a more mountainous community, so it's higher elevation, more alpine desert area. They have very similar population size. They are of the same ancestry, just different tribes, and so they are two of the tribes that we work with most closely. And they have had very different trajectories in terms of their RMSF prevention. So tribe number 1 has a very strong animal control program. The man that leads the animal control program has been there for over a decade and has been doing this. He's understaffed. It's him and 2 other people that are the full animal control and RMSF prevention. They take care of dog bites. They help provide vaccine services. They, respond to, roadkill incidents and everything else like that on top of doing RMSF prevention. But he's been doing it for a long time, so he's become very well versed in this. And through his leadership, he has been very strongly promoting animal wellness throughout his time as the animal control program officer. And so that has spurred the development of a local animal rescue group. So within the tribe, some community members came together and developed a community rescue group that will take care of sick animals. They spread community education and things of that nature. In addition to this, that tribe also has 3 to 4 prevention campaigns throughout the year. So this is where they apply those long-lasting tick collars or topical treatments on dogs to prevent dogs from getting ticks. They spray everyone's home, or as many homes as they can, with pesticide, and they conduct community education. And when I say conduct community education, I mean, not just posting up a flyer or anything like that. People are going directly to the home and talking directly to the homeowner, getting kids involved and things of that nature. Tribe 2 has separate programs for animal control and their RMSF prevention, and unfortunately they have experienced higher turnover. They did have one person in charge of the RMSF program for several years, but he moved on, and since then they've had 3 more people take on his role. They're also understaffed, which is a very common theme. I'm sure you'll hear that anywhere you go. And not only do they not have an internal wellness group, but they also have a harder time networking with services. Part of this is because of their high turnover. They've had a harder time building networks because they haven't been around as long. But also, tribe number 2 is a little bit more remote, so it's harder to get volunteer services to come in. They also conduct prevention campaigns, and they aim to have a couple every year, but they're more sporadic. They're not as thoughtfully planned. And because of how severely understaffed they are, they're unable to get to as many homes as tribe number 1. And both of these tribes have ongoing RMSF transmission. So last year, we were very excited because both tribes, as part of a grant funded through CDC, decided to conduct surveys of their communities to get some understanding of knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs around tick identification, knowledge of RMSF, animal wellness, things of that nature. The tribes conducted these in different manners, but there was some overlap in the questions, so it gives us a good opportunity to compare where the 2 tribes are in terms of knowledge of RMSF. So you can see from the graph here that this was a question where the survey participants were asked to correctly identify any ticks that they saw. Does anyone want to tell us which ones are ticks and which ones are not? Of course you know. So you'll see a flat tick as B, and then a fully engorged female as D. And you'll see that we have, thank you. You'll see that we had pretty good responses from both of the tribes. Knowledge of tick identification was between 80 and 90% for both tribes. So that was great to see. Then another question that overlapped was, what would you do if you found a tick on yourself or a family member? Go to the hospital for antibiotics is not one of the answers that we were hoping for, but it was commonly chosen in both tribes. But we did see that, most people know, first of all, that you remove the tick, but there was a higher understanding that you should watch for the signs and symptoms of RMSF in tribe number 1 compared to tribe number 2. And so these differences in the knowledge and of RMSF in these 2 tribes is also reflected in their case counts. So very fortunately in Arizona, we have not had a fatality from RMSF since 2019. And I largely attribute this to how well people know about this disease and how well people understand the risk factors around it. So we know that there's been some disturbance in surveillance since 2020, and in fact, tribe number 2 is still struggling to get back online after a very long, prolonged interruption from COVID. They actually only reopened their community to visitors last year. They were very highly impacted by COVID-19, so it took all of the resources from their hospital and their community health representatives. But you can see the difference in the understanding of these tribes on community awareness of the disease, and I also believe that this ties back to their animal wellness beliefs. So like I said, in tribe number 1, there's been a strong integration of improving animal wellness into their communication efforts with their communities, whereas tribe number 2 has not experienced that. So we strongly encourage all of the tribes that we work with to integrate this One Health approach and bring animal wellness to the table when talking about RMSF prevention. So we know that the integrated pest management strategy was effective, but obviously we're never going to eradicate the ticks. We're not going to get rid of RMSF. So we have to figure out a better way to live with it, a better way to improve our conditions around it. And I believe that community education, and not only education, but also empowerment, giving the people the tools that they need to make the right decisions are critical. But this does not mean that you just tell people what to do and then not take care of the ticks at all. So we still have to take care of the tick burden, especially on dogs, because they are that host, and around people's homes. So what does that look like? Where does the dog play a role in RMSF prevention? Well, you've seen this diagram multiple times now, but it is the perfect way to describe why this is so necessary. At each point when the tick is feeding on a dog, that's an opportunity to break the cycle. So by treating dogs, we can break the cycle at each of these places, whether it's when the tick is a larva, nymph, or adult, by treating the dog with a acaricides and making sure not only that it's got tick prevention, but that it's also generally well. So tick prevention on dogs, you're like, oh, well, if people are dying, then why would we want to, take care of the dog's health where we're more concerned about people? But by preventing the infection on dogs, you can prevent the subsequent infection of the ticks. So there will be fewer ticks that will be able to transmit this on to people. And so by preventing the infection on dogs and ticks, you can prevent the transmission to people. And not only that, but just general wellness of dogs can improve their ability to handle being sick with other diseases. So, we have heard that puppies are immunologically naive to Rickettsia or rickettsii, and therefore are more susceptible to getting infections. Puppies also have, weaker immune systems in general, just because they haven't been exposed to much. And, not only that, but when a dog is sick with another disease, it will decrease their immune system's ability to fight off being highly parasitized by multiple ticks and succumbing to subsequent infection. So in addition to applying tick preventives, we also work with tribes on just improving dog health. So conducting wellness campaigns where dogs are vaccinated, not only given tick collars, but also vaccinated against rabies and parvo and distemper and other zoonotic diseases. If dogs are unspayed or unneutered, then increasing the capacity in the area or partnering with a nonprofit to conduct spay and neuter services, because not only does it reduce the number of dogs in the area, which, like I said, it's kind of a drop in the bucket, but a sterilized animal is less likely to roam as far. And then building the ownership between building the relationship between the dog and the owner across the community. So this really comes down to, talking about who is a pet owner. Like I said earlier, there are people that are like, that's not my dog, I just feed it and take care of it. That's your dog. that is your dog. And so as the person that is feeding and taking care of this dog, you need to make sure that it is spayed. You need to make sure that it has access to food, that it's up to date on vaccines, and perhaps most importantly, that it stays in your property. That is one of the messages that we really emphasize, is making sure that dogs stay on your property so that they are not spreading ticks around the area. And so veterinary care, as you're coming to hear, is incredibly important in this context. Unfortunately, much like a lot of areas in northern Mexico, it seems, these two tribes are veterinary deserts. There are no vets on either tribe that are permanently housed there. And for each of the tribes, I think the closest vet that I can think of to either one of them is about an hour-and-a-half drive. And these are communities where a large proportion of people don't even have a car. So there are many logistical challenges to partnering with nonprofit veterinary services, but it is the best way that the tribes have identified to get animal wellness visits, spay and neuter for their community members. One of the things that tribes in Arizona have been working on a lot is building a coalition, and through that, one of the biggest things that has been talked about has been building internal capacity for veterinary wellness. So we're trying to partner with the tribes and the University of Arizona that has a vet program to get more indigenous students enrolled in school to become vet techs or veterinarians, so they can bring that knowledge back to their communities and help to improve animal wellness. And that goes right into this, building those partnerships and establishing coalitions. The coalition is not only people who are in animal wellness or animal control, but also in public health. We at CDC, we sit on these calls. The state health department may participate, and then the veterinarians that are involved will be there. And we even encourage, the Indian Health Service hospitals and clinics to become engaged in these conversations as well, because no organization can work in a silo. We need to break down the barriers and work with one another across disciplines in order to fight this disease. And perhaps most importantly, bringing the community in to that partnership and making sure that the community that you're working with feels empowered to take on responsibility themselves. That is more important than any of the other things that I'm saying, in all honesty. By giving people the knowledge and the tools that they need, they will be able to, if their house isn't taken care of during a pesticide application, or their dog isn't given a tick collar by someone from the outside, they'll know what services to provide for themselves. So I've already described this a little bit, but making sure that the role of the dog owner is defined, and then explaining to people how the health of their dog is impacting their family. If this is highly cyclical, so if a dog has a lot of ticks, but also has mange or another ectoparasite, people may be so grossed out, so disgusted, and not want to touch that animal, and so the animal will become sicker. And then those ticks will drop off, and they'll bite a person in the house, and so it contributes to disease. So explaining to people that by taking action quickly when they notice the problem at first, you can help them to understand that protecting their dog means protecting themselves. And not every community is going to be able to, have wellness events or provide spay and neuter services. But where you can't be the resource, you can help people find the resource so that they can seek something out. The other thing that you've heard a lot, and the other role that dogs play in RMSF prevention is being sentinels for human risk of RMSF. So they, are the preferred host. They get parasitized by ticks more often. And we have evidence that dogs will be seropositive in an area before there are human cases. So studying the dogs and monitoring, using them as surveillance is a great way to know that know the level of risk in an area. And this entire One Health approach ties into all of the other capacity building activities that go around RMSF prevention. So none of this is very directly tied to animal wellness, but I believe that it is all interconnected. So, creating the long-term and short-term goals as a community, not only just public health or the medical staff, but holistically integrating, the community into that, making sure that community education is going on, that animal wellness is going on. All of these goals need to be tied together so that it can be one large movement forward instead of a couple small movements here and there. And then, we heard yesterday all about laboratory capacity and the strengths and weaknesses of diagnosis. That is integral for knowing the community risk. And there are a bunch of young medical students here, so I feel like I'm, preaching to the choir, but training healthcare professionals is an absolutely important part of RMSF prevention and making sure that that RMSF in humans is caught early and treated. But also, I believe that equally as important is educating and empowering the public to take on their role in this as well. And then supporting vector control efforts. We saw earlier that the integrated pest management approach, pesticides around homes and treating dogs are effective. But they need to be maintained, they need to be consistent, and it's a lot of work, but it's worth it. And then, no field can move forward without advancing through research. And I have some examples of how these things can be done, but I don't want to spend too much time going over each and every point. But lab capacity is making sure that the methods are specific and sensitive, are important. And when it comes to training healthcare professionals, the most important parts are making sure that not only doctors, but also community health representatives or promotoras and doctors that are in private practice are also aware that we can't wait until the diagnosis to treat, and also that they know that doxycycline is the proper treatment even in very young patients, because that's a big point of hesitancy. In terms of educating the public, we focus on making sure that they know the signs and symptoms and what to look out for RMSF, not just when they've been bitten by a tick or when they can recall an exposure, but when incidence is high, you want to make sure that they're just always vigilant and if they're experiencing those signs and symptoms that they go to seek care. Personal protective measures is kind of a loaded public health message. For most other ticks, you are exposed or at risk of being exposed to ticks in very finite time intervals. So it's, when you go out hiking or when you're gardening, things of that nature. The brown dog tick doesn't care where you are. It's in the home. So you can promote personal protective measures, talk to people about like how to prevent ticks from biting you. But really the more important part is to, how to check your body for ticks and then to know what to do if you do find a tick. Empowering people to take their own initiative to reduce tick infections if they're capable of doing so, if they have the resources to do so. That's also very important. And then, as I've said over and over again, the role of animal health. So the vector control efforts really come down to not only vector surveillance, but also pesticide application, and then using those integrated techniques. I like to consider reducing the harborage around the yard into this. As you've seen, the ticks will, even if there is no harborage, they'll find cracks and crevices to crawl into. But the fewer places that there are around the property that can be infested by ticks, the better. And then just a few ideas of how to advance knowledge of RMSF through research. There's always opportunities for new research to be conducted, and especially as you get started in your careers, I really encourage you to make partners with people from other disciplines so that you can be part of the research and be part of the movement forward. And that's it.
Oh, so there are one question and one comment. So in your experience, which tick preventive measure has proven to be more cost-effective in marginalized communities?
I love this question. None of them. So a lot of the tribes that we work with use Seresto collars. They are very expensive up front, but they are long-lasting. And I know that the cost will be different in the U.S. compared to Mexico and what's available, but we have found that tribes, commercially, you can purchase a Seresto collar for, I think it's about $60 now, $60 US, but it lasts 8 months. Whereas Bravecto is an oral medication that prevents ticks and fleas. It's about half the cost, but lasts about half the time. So those that end up really being a wash. And then you have topical treatments that are effective for 1 month, and they're also the cheapest. So it doesn't really come down to which is most cost effective, it's which is most sustainable. If it's your own animal, are you going to be able to remember every month to apply? Or if you are doing a community campaign, are you going to be able to go out every month to treat all of the dogs with a topical? Or is it better to put something on that's going to last 8 months? So really, the cost doesn't matter so much as the effort involved in applying it.
Okay, thank you. And one last comment is, I feel like asking each person to take responsibility for their own dog is really hard when the community doesn't provide resources. I think we need to ask governments to step up their game to provide vet care, spay and neuter, shelters, and adoption.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that it needs to be a little bit of both. And one of the things that I believe has been most effective in tribal communities, there is, at least in one of the tribe number 1 that I was discussing, there has been a push to, encourage people to assume responsibility for their own pets, but they also see how invested the tribal government is in reducing the risk of RMSF. So it is coming from both the top down and the bottom up, which is the best way to do it.
Okay, congratulations, Maureen. I think like you have been doing a very good job at following up all these years the outbreak. And actually, I am kind of jealous because I would like to have the possibility or being able to follow up the outbreak in just one community in order to learn more, learn a little bit more about what is going on. And in terms of that, I have a question. Like, how many people live in those tribes? And do you know how many dogs are around? Like, that's actually.
So each population is about 10,000 people. The number of dogs, I know that both tribes have attempted dog population estimates, but not very standardized. So when we do prevention campaigns, we go house to house to apply the tick collars and the pesticide. We're also collecting data. We're collecting information on how many dogs there are and how many are infested with ticks. I don't have those numbers because they belong to the tribe, but I know that the average number of dogs in both communities is, I think, 3 dogs per home.
Interesting. Okay, so I can see that the towns are quite big. I mean, 10,000 people. Have you seen any special pattern of the cases in the communities?
I think Johanna is going to show a little bit of that tomorrow, but we did an ecologic evaluation with tribe number 1 with assistance from Dave Wagner at Northern Arizona University. And what we found was about 1% of the ticks were infected with Rickettsia, but it was kind of sporadic distribution throughout the time frame we were looking. But tick abundance, we found there were more focal areas of tick infestation, but 2/3 of the homes in these communities at any given time have tick infestations.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Excellent work. I think the data is very revealing and very promising. The knowledge of the communities and applied these control measures is definitely dropping down the caseloads to the point where there are no deaths for the last 3-4 years, which is really impressive definition of the data, how the disease can easily be controlled if all these measures are put together. There is no vaccine here. And the tick infection is so low. My question, these are the comments, but question is, did you look at what is the infection rates in those dogs, in those communities?
So some seroprevalence was done many years ago, I think about 15 years ago in one of the communities. I don't recall those numbers offhand. We have tried to pick that back up. Of course, it was in 2021 as things were just, or early 2022 when things were just coming back after the pandemic. So we were only able to sample twice in the same area. We found 25% of dogs had seropositivity to rickettsial species, just pan-Rickettsia, not Rickettsia, but none had active infections when we looked. But we're hoping to collect more data in the next year.
Yeah. How do you say there are no active infections? So,
well, none were PCR positive for Rickettsia.
So it's not PCR positive doesn't mean
Yeah.
they're not active infections.
That's true. Yeah.
But that's the only option you got because you can't pick up the infection by PCR.
Right.
Did you try the nested PCR as a means? I know it's more.
I didn't conduct the lab work.
Yeah.
It was real time? Yeah.
Yeah, real time. Okay, thank you.
Voy a hacer el comentario en español, porque quisiera que la mayoría de los aquí presentes entendieran el punto. Hablando de intervenciones y de costo, efectividad y costo-beneficio, nosotros en Sonora hicimos la intervención rodeo. Okay. Okay. I can speak in English, but I would like to make this comment in Spanish because
I'm understanding.
yeah, okay, thank you, because I think it's important to give this comment in Spanish for my people. So, nosotros hicimos esta intervención rodeo en una comunidad muy pobre del estado de Sonora, con indígenas que ni siquiera son procedentes del estado de Sonora. Costó 3.5 millones de pesos la intervención para 10 cuadras. 10 cuadras. En términos de salud pública, es infinitamente alto el costo. es muy elevado, muy elevado. Y cuando uno pone en la balanza en términos de salud pública eso, para hacer política pública es muy difícil y es algo que se discute. No son sostenibles ni escalables. Pero mi punto es que en esta enfermedad, en adición al concepto técnico de si es costo benéfico o costo eficaz la intervención, nosotros tenemos que poner una visión ética, porque esto es un dilema moral el que enfrentamos. Yo en clases les he dicho, nosotros no sabemos a cuántas personas, cuántos niños salvamos. Yo sí sé cuántas personas estimamos salvamos en esa intervención de 3.5 millones de pesos. Cada año en el poblado Miguel Alemán, voy a decir el nombre, teníamos una mortalidad entre 8 y 12 niños que fallecían por año. En 2 años de la intervención no falleció ni uno solo. Pregunto, ¿valió la pena la intervención? Estas intervenciones no pueden ser globales, deben ser dirigidas a poblaciones de alto riesgo. Pero yo quisiera, y con esto finalizo, que en salud pública y en Rickettsia, en adición al concepto técnico de si es costo eficaz o costo benéfico una intervención, nosotros usáramos o antepusiéramos una visión ética, porque en adición a un problema de salud pública, creo que estamos en un dilema moral. Y yo creo que las intervenciones de esta magnitud, como las que nos presenta, y yo digo, Sonora ha sido privilegiado y fue privilegiado como Mexicali ha sido, porque CDC ayudó a esas intervenciones. No sé si esos niños que evitamos que murieran sigan vivos. Voy a ser muy duro en este comentario. Y no sé qué sean en el futuro, pero creo que como médicos, como salubristas, como epidemiólogos, como biólogos, lo que queremos es eso, garantizar la sobrevida de las personas, ¿no? Yo creo, sinceramente, que estas intervenciones son valiosas. So, thank you very much for your wonderful talk, Maureen, because you are a field epidemiologist, so you know the suffering in and around homes in that communities, in such communities. So I think we are dealing with a horrible problem that in addition to technical details and a technical point of view, we need to use ethical perspective to deal with that at the population level.
Yeah, to your point, ask any parent how much they'd be willing to pay to save their child.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ya no hay otra participación, al parecer ya no, ¿verdad? Entonces vamos a darle un reconocimiento. We're going to thank you for your important talk. El Departamento de Medicina y Ciencias de la Salud de la Facultad Interdisciplinaria de Ciencias Biológicas y de la Salud de la Universidad de Sonora le da este reconocimiento por su conferencia El enfoque una salud, una estrategia de salud pública para lidiar con las enfermedades transmitidas por garrapatas. Muchísimas gracias. Y tras esta presentación de la doctora Maureen, pues nos vamos a ir a comer, ¿qué les parece? Vamos a tener 1 hora para comer, son las 2:10, entonces nos vamos a ver a las 3:10, exactamente. Ayúdenos a seguir con el programa bien. Gracias.
My feelings are intense.